The biggest thing in a mode like this is having a game plan, figuring things out, and then being flexible.
When you're in the idea business, you live or die by the strength of that idea, and you're better off pushing it to make the best idea.
So what assumptions are you making and what you don't see, right? And it's hard to be like, okay, what am I not seeing? But ask yourself that over and over again. You start to see around corners.
What's one thing you should do and what's one thing you should avoid like the plague? Welcome to Marketing from the Edge podcast. I'm Jon Alexander. I've directly generated over $200 million in net revenue over the last 5 years through innovative marketing and a numbers-first strategy. Joined with me is my dad. Jon Alexander has become the go-to expert in the direct marketing field, generating over $1.5 billion in revenue over the last 5 years. Sought by both board of directors and nine-figure businesses, he is an owner/founder of Centurion Publishing and is on the journey of growing this brand new business from 0 to 100 million in annual revenue. Warning, today's episode is going to be different. Instead of a conversation on how we'd grow any business, we want to let you see exactly what we're doing to grow one of our own businesses. This is a special series updating you specifically on Jon Alexander and his company's journey to $100 million. You'll learn what has happened, what he's doing right now, and what's next. This is a chance to peek behind the curtain and understand the mindset, the strategies, and the tactics behind going from 0 to 100 million in revenue. You'll want to have your notebook or app ready for this extended episode. All right, you're in for a special episode today. We are going to give you an update on Jon building his $100 million business, how things started, where we're at today, and what's next. So the first question I have for you is, obviously 5 months ago, you're 5 months into this thing, you had a vision, right? You had a plan for what you were going to do going into this. I'd love to hear, what was that plan going into building this business?
It has been 5 months, which is kind of hard to believe. As you start through this stuff, there's things that clearly go faster and things that go slower. But my plan and vision going in is that in a couple of different industries I'd been in, I worked in areas where you can be a generalist or a specialist. So lots of times you can market like a generalist and then create a specialist product. For instance, if you want to be a real estate investor, you go after other real estate investors to try to attract them into your product.
Okay.
Right? That's fine, but you compete in a very small area, right?
You have a niche within the niche, right? Maybe it's just a zip code.
Real estate investing in general is not a very big niche, right? The nice thing about financial publishing is that it impacts nearly every single person uses money for something. So the thing with real estate investing, there's only so many people that want to do real estate investing. And now you have to compete with all the other people that want to teach them real estate investing. And so leads are much more expensive, right? Same thing if you're in the legal field or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if you broaden that and you help people solve their money problems and you go after a money niche, it's a much bigger niche. A chunk of those people that you're talking to them about money and help them with budgeting and all the other things will want to be real estate investors. Right? A chunk of those people will want to be stock investors. A chunk of those people will want to get into life insurance sales or whatever, right? And so what you can do is, because it's a more general field, right? Leads cost less, but overall you don't get them all, right? So if you get 100 up here, there's a number. And for me, that number's always been about 15%.
Oh, wow. That feels low.
Yeah. And it's all just about math at the end of the day, right? If it costs me $10 to get a lead directly going after real estate investing, it costs me $1 to get a money lead, and only 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 6 are worth anything, well, I'm still better off. It only cost me $6 instead of 10, right?
Yeah.
The beauty of that is that 10 or 15% of those people want to be stock investors. So you sell those off to a stock investor company, right? You can sell off
you
those
help
that you don't use.
You let other people help them with a problem that you're not going to help them with.
Exactly. So again, I've done this 2 or 3 times. Well, 2.5, I guess, technically. The half was interesting, right? Because you didn't go after as broad a niche. You went after a much smaller, but it was still bigger than if you just went point to point, right?
I see.
So I'd done this. So in working on this business, one of the things that I'd known is that, the company that we kind of partnered up with, the trading company, I'm like, look, you're bringing in leads, bring them into your mix, right? Buyers or whatever, mix into your mix. After 10 or 15 days, they figured out, oh, you guys are just traders. You're not investors. So the investors jettison.
Right.
The traders stay. Right. That's what your whole goal is. Right. You don't want the investors to hang out because they're going to be unhappy. You want day traders. So in that day trader niche, one of the things that I said is, look, the thing is, though, those investors just leave on their own. But if you had a bolt-on business that was an investing business to bolt onto it, those leads that are coming through, you can recoup. Now you have a trading thing. Now you have an investing thing. Like if we wanted to, we could line up a real estate guy to do real estate stuff, because a chunk of those guys would want that too, because I know it based on experience. So my assumption going in is that off this general lead list that I kind of had the benefit of centralized services and a chunk of leads, that a percentage of those guys would be interested in what we have to offer, in addition to going out and buying new leads.
So this is where you went out and you got a business partner, right? And you said,
so my plan going in was partner up with somebody, has a bunch of leads already, that's in a field that is, I guess, a sister field, right? Trading and investing are fairly similar, but most traders aren't investors and most investors aren't traders. There is some overlap, but not always.
I agree. Some people want to sit there and make an investment and watch it grow. And some people want to make a trade and then get out. They want to make a little bit of money and then call it good. Some people want to be right big, right? They want to have the stock that's going to build their portfolio in a meaningful way. Everyone's got different motivations. Some people want to buy a boat and some people want to retire. You don't want to wait 10 years to buy a boat. So I just want to dig in a little more into it. So you go to this business partner and you're like, look, you've got the resources. I've got the skill set, right? I have what we need to build a business and monetize, and you have leads and centralized services. Like, how does that pitch? And you don't have to get specific because, I'm sure it was nuanced, but how do you go about presenting something like that where you're saying, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do?
Well, I think so. It doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. The fact is, I just sold $1.5 billion worth of newsletters over the last 7 years. So I had a reputation. That definitely helps. That's why I actually had multiple opportunities to do stuff post-legacy. I had 8 to 10 within 24 hours.
Wild.
But that's what happens when you build a reputation. Before that, as you're building a reputation, or if you don't have one yet, you have to deal with your conviction and share your vision and what you think's going on. You have to sell yourself. Like, you actually have to go in and be like, hey, I can do this. When I first got into marketing, I literally sat down with a guy and I'm like, hey, I'd always done marketing for our own businesses, but when I actually decided, hey, I'm going to do this for somebody else's business, I actually took him to lunch, sat down, and I'm like, hey, I know you just lost your marketing director. I can do this. Here's what I got.
Wow.
Here's how it works. I know how to do this. And he's like, to begin with, I was offended, but now that I've realized that you really know what you're doing, then let's figure it out.
At first I was offended and now I'm happy.
Well, because nobody wants to be told, hey, you got problems in your business, right? I could have approached it better, actually. But I was confident in the fact that I could fix his problem, so I didn't really care how I came across. So I think you have to live on one side or the other, right? You either live on your ambition and your internal grit to just figure it out and know how to do it. Or in my case, at this stage of the game, right, I built a reputation for myself. And so you work off your reputation. The other side is that when you know something with 100% conviction, which is I'd already done it 2.5 times. I'd already taken a general set of names, shoved them over into a specific set and pulled it out and turned it into a business. I'm like, I already know what's going on. I know full well that a chunk of those leads are going by the wayside. I know it from legacy because we were mostly investors, not traders. So most of the trading leads went by the wayside because we didn't partner up with anybody. And I'm like, hey, all those leads, 15 to 20% of leads, we could actually monetize. We could do something with if we wanted to. So when you have that internal conviction on something, it's not that hard to sit down and be like, hey, I can do this. This is how it works. This is what goes on.
Yeah. You combine reputation with passion. And at least it got your foot in the door to starting it with resources instead of grinding it without.
And honestly, what reputation got me more was more resources, not less, right? It gives you a little longer runway, a little longer chance where somebody's willing to invest in you or invest in your company until it turns a profit.
That's
and
interesting.
Reputation also gives you a little more personal stake. I got a bigger stake in this business than I would have without the reputation.
Because they're coming in with an assumption and you want to prove them right.
Yeah. So before I built this reputation in the financial industry, I was working with a guy on attorneys. I went in on a straight salary, knowing full well that I was ultimately going to get a percentage of profits when I proved what I could do. But I didn't have the reputation of fixing things like I did now in this when I sat down with him. So I had to take a lower salary and no percentage of the company and earn it.
Yeah.
Right. In this case, I was able to get a higher salary and a higher percentage of the company because of the reputation.
I want to fast forward a little bit. You get it set up and you go in, let's call it month one, you're getting your feet wet, getting everything set up. I know this from experience.
Oh, yeah.
IPs and domains and your website's getting built.
Yeah.
It's all this stuff that doesn't really move the needle, but you have to get right. Otherwise, it sets you back.
Especially nowadays.
So once you got that foundation set, what was your initial game plan? If I do A, B, and C, that will bode well. What was it initially?
So the foundation, let's talk about that for a second before I go into the post foundation. While it's been 5 months, really it's only been about 2 months of building the business. Well, the first 6 weeks were a joint venture thing to put money into the business. The next 6 weeks were fixing IPs. We started with one software program, started with an IP, started with domain, ended up messing it all up, right? We had some assumptions going in, right? I'll talk about that in a little bit. We had some assumptions going in that turned out to not be true. So then we had to start over. Well, that puts you back 3 weeks. And then you got to build momentum. So really,
that's amazing. 3 weeks. I mean, think about, you talk about having permission to get some extra runway. You essentially had a false start, right? Like you're moving in the right direction and then you have to restart 3 weeks worth of work.
And that's 3 weeks is generous. It was really closer to 6.
Obviously, you roll with the punches in business, but that's got to be one of those ones that's got to be a sucker punch.
But you talked about short-term versus long-term, right? Yes, if we hadn't had the runway and we were focused much more on short-term, we could have pushed further utilizing that stuff, dealing with it. Ultimately, though, in the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to make less money, but you would have made money faster.
I see. The difference was you could have made it work by dealing with what you had, but you would rather have done it right.
Yeah. So the IPs, basically, let's talk about that for a second, right?
I don't think either of us
Your
are,
brother,
frankly.
my other son is the tech guy, right? Which is fantastic. It's all about inbox placement, right? It's IP health and inbox placement. The reality is that it's not like we went from 100% inbox to 0 and now you have no business, right? We went from 100 to 50. We could have kept working at 50 and ultimately fixed things later on down the road and taken longer. But we just chose, because we're right in the beginning, to reset it and go back to 100.
So it was a 6-week setback, but it really, like you said, 6 months from then, it saved you 6 months worth of work.
I mean, even right now, it's paying off for us, right? Because every lead you get in, now instead of getting 2 leads and only one actually communicating with them, we're getting 2 leads and communicating with you.
Yeah, you doubled your effectiveness.
So,
imagine
and that's just
efficiency.
a simple, anybody that knows about inbox placement IP is like, it doesn't work like that.
I know.
No, like that's my general concept, right? And it was still working. It just wasn't working to the level it was. And it all had to do with domain health and the software system we were using at the time. Because believe it or not, your CRM can make or break your IP health and inbox placement. Yeah. See, like whether you use Infusionsoft or Keep, whatever the name they want to use for themselves,
that's
right?
a 4-letter word, literally.
We use OptiPub now, right? Whether you use Iterable, whether you use Salesforce, like all of them, they have their own relationship, their own set of IPs, their own deals going on with Gmail and Hotmail.
I've heard good things about Samcart, and they are a pseudo CRM. Like there's
1,000
good
of it
ones
out there, right? The reality is there's no one perfect system, because if there was, everybody be in it and none of the others exist. But depending on which industry you're in, how you're doing, how often you email.
Yeah, your point is like there's
things.
external factors that can impact something. So I think it's interesting to dig into when you have something foundational to doing business and making the decision on, are you going to fix it later, which you absolutely could do, or are you going to fix it now? You just weighted the value. I want to dive into this a little bit. You talked about one thing your business partner had was the asset, which is the list. The whole reason I'm partnering with this person is for the asset. If I don't maximize the value of that asset, then what was the point of getting in the first place?
And it's not the whole reason I partner with them, right?
Obviously,
but if you're going to partner with somebody, it's a relationship, right? You got to understand the skeletons of the closet. You got to understand what you bring to the table, what they bring to the table, right?
There's a lot of value in that.
Yes,
asset.
But clearly the asset was one of those things that gave me the confidence in being able to say, hey, look, I can turn this into $50 million in 3 years. And I also know that because we're kind of a bolt-on company, like we're not necessarily doing the same things. It's taking the same asset he have, and it's not cannibalizing what he's doing on the other company, but actually adding on to what they're doing off of the same asset.
Yeah, like you said, it's incredible. You're solving a different problem. And so it's not competing. But I want to ask, we always talk about acquisition, monetization, and then maximization or
Optimization. I call it.
optimization. Thank you.
Yep.
And it's good. I've indoctrinated myself out of the word. That's how good I've gotten. What was one thing you're like, here's what I'm going to do for acquisition. Here's the one thing I'm going to do in monetization. And obviously optimization is kind of a longer tail thing, but walk me through one thing in each of those areas.
Okay. So acquisition, one of the things that made us the most successful in Legacy is we had a two-pronged acquisition approach. If you looked across most of Agora, right? I'll just start using the word Agora because primarily we're all in the same umbrella. MarketWise was a subsidiary of Agora and Legacy was a subsidiary of MarketWise, right? That's where the cash all went. So ultimately, that's who's responsible. They almost entirely over the years had always done a direct-to-paid acquisition model. They would put out a video sales letter or whatever, direct mail piece, whatever, because they came from the direct mail world back in the 70s, right? But they would put out a piece and they would only worry about those that ordered and they would never worry about the others. And if you look at most businesses across, like every small business I was involved in and almost anyone you talk to, they can't afford to do that. You have to acquire those leads in addition to trying to monetize or get a direct to paid model because otherwise you can't afford to do it, right? Most companies don't have $220 or $250 a lead to spend on acquiring that first customer. So they've got to make money. So when I first got there, I'm like, this is the most asinine thing I've ever seen. Why don't you acquire the name at the same time? Why don't you get the lead? And they're like, well, we just never done it like that. Well, yeah, no shit. Okay. So what we did at Legacy about 2 years into this is that Fernando and I came from an outside outside of Agora world.
Yeah.
Right. So we knew this was one of those things. One of the things that you should know going into any company is, okay, so somebody that hasn't been in the Agora world for 15 years, when they come in from the outside, what are those that are successful? What did they do? And what are those that are unsuccessful? What did they do? Right. And when you step in and you pay attention to that, right? And you think, okay, what's the difference? Right. I'm coming in from the outside into their world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and whether it's in Agora or anywhere else, think about this, right? The number one thing you can do is don't come in and tell everybody how to do it. Come in and do it their way. So what I did, same advice I gave you when you came in, I'm
100%.
like, hey, you spend the first 6 months, right? Don't forget what you know, but just try to learn it their way. Obviously, Agora has been around for 50 friggin' years, right? They've done something right.
Exactly.
So the ones that struggle the most come in and be like, oh, we should change all this up and do it like this. Long form doesn't work. Short form, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. They want to tell you how business should be done.
Yeah. And the thing is, I came in at a really high level into the Agora world. It's easy. I could have went in and just said, hey, you guys are doing everything wrong. This is how you do it. But that doesn't work. So while I knew, hey, we should be capturing leads, while Fernando knew we should be capturing leads. The reality is the two of us knew enough when we came into this world to be like, they've done it right for a while. Why don't we learn the way they're doing it, do it 90% their way and 10% our way.
Yeah.
And then start to adjust. So that's ultimately what we ended up doing was we started a lead gen program, put names into a list, nurture them, and then sell them something. Imagine that. What it does is when you bring names into a list, nurture them and sell them versus going on a direct to CPA model, what happens is, especially at the right price, bringing those leads into the list, it allows you to blend out your total acquisition cost.
Yeah, we've talked about that before.
Yeah, and your blended CPA now comes down. So instead of spending $150 a name, these names over here that you got for $1 that you converted it at 1.2%, right? So you're roughly cost you an $80 CPA. $80 CPA, $150 CPA. If you brought 50% on each side, all of a sudden you got $120 CPA.
Well, if you paid for the name in a previous month, you're not going to double count the cost just because they bought in a month or two later.
And you don't know when they're going to buy, right?
Exactly.
Well, the other beautiful thing about this, it does
model.
two things. Number one, it lowers your overall CPA, right?
Yep.
Which lets your marketing budget go further. Instead of running around, Agora had lived in the 90-day break even, and I'm like, this is the most asinine thing I've ever seen, right?
I just explained the other day to my team. It's like a scary thought.
Why don't we break even on day 7 or day 10? But it allows you to do that. But the other thing is, and this is just common sense, and intuitively we all know it. Ultimately, we could back it up with the math because we figured it out. But if somebody's scrolling around on Facebook, right, looking at family, looking at whatever, they happen to see your ad, they click on it, they go buy your product, right, they're going to be worth such and such a value. If somebody came in a lead, read every one of your e-letters for 30 days, eventually decided to buy your product, they know, like, and trust you more than the guy that had no intention of buying your product, but happened to buy it because he was on Facebook.
Right. That goes into another number we talked about, lifetime value.
The lead version always has a higher lifetime value. And so in our case, it almost a 2x lifetime value, 90-day value, we'll use that. And 90 days, the lead that came in on that bot that was nurtured was worth twice as much as the lead that went direct to paid. Now, that doesn't mean you shut down direct to paid. You do both.
Right. Well, and you can be efficient with your resources.
Yeah. So that's the acquisition part, right? So the acquisition part for us is, okay, so this company had all these leads. I was hoping we were getting, right? We were get 20 to 35% of those names convert over. My assumption is we were going to get 15. We're at 16 and a half right now.
Okay.
16% of those names, 1 out of every 7, basically, that came into the trading world want to be an investor.
Yeah.
We mix that in, and we've also got a direct to paid going. You mix those two together, it lowers our overall CPA and allows you to run a little bit further. So on the acquisition, that was my plan. And that's now literally just come to fruition 5 months into this business.
Wow.
Right over the last probably 2 weeks, we really got that to the point that, okay, this is working. And now you're in scale mode.
And I want to ask you, now that it's working, what's happening? But first, I want to go back to how you plan to acquire, which we've talked about on this podcast, like is one of the most important and one of the most difficult things you do in business, right? Like convincing the unconvinced is difficult. And the unconvinced is essentially cold traffic, right?
Like you talked about. Exactly.
Someone scrolled through, look at their family and getting them to say, you know what? I am having problems with where my portfolio is today or whatever.
Or whatever it is. Right? My health issue. Or
my I want to buy that house.
Exactly. I need my credit fixed or whatever.
But like getting someone to turn heel and look at that is one of the most difficult things to do. And so that just came to fruition. One of the shortcuts, though, to being a successful business is monetization.
Yep.
What were your plans initially with that?
So my plan initially was to build out a fairly robust monetization plan right off the bat. If I look back 5 months into this thing, the one mistake I made was I built too much of a monetization plan too soon. And so,
that's interesting to hear.
So you're always going to make mistakes, right? The big thing is, and we'll talk about it on a future episode, right?
But I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say the problem I made is I tried too hard to make money.
Like, most companies undermarket. No two ways around it, right? The challenge is you can actually overmarket.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to do. And you got to be really good at marketing to do it. And we managed to do it. I got some really good marketers on my team. And so, we want to run the plan, right? We know what the plan is. We know how to get to 50 million. We want to run the plan. But you have to have enough of a base in order to run the plan that we're running. So we've adjusted the plan a little bit. And we'll talk about that a little bit.
We've talked about in the past of like, look, you need to provide value to get permission to market. If you haven't built enough value, you only get so much permission. And so you need to build the value so you can execute your plan.
Yeah, exactly. And so we need the acquisition on the front end in order to execute the plan that we want to execute, which is a mixture of live one-day events, live webinars, pre-recorded webinars, and then a mixture of what I call quarterly webinars, which is basically a much bigger subject, right? With a 2 or 3 or 5 day training sequence with videos. In order to do all that stuff, you have to have enough names up front. So I originally thought we could do 1 front end and 2 back ends. That's what I turned on right off the bat. I'm like, hey, we'll get 1 front end going. That'll generate the names. We'll monetize off of this list of leads. We'll convert those into the front end. We've got direct to paid over here. We'll convert that into the front end. We'll run that front end and we'll run 2 back ends, which was just way too aggressive.
So that's actually really interesting. So I'm going to skip the first month and say by this point, you should have had 3 or 4 front end promos.
We have 2. We launched our first front end in August. The second front end was going to be in September. We actually got it launched in August as well.
Oh, wow.
Right. So we got basically the August and September. The October, we chose not to launch a front end, and we have 2 front ends launching in November.
That's a really interesting time to launch 2 front ends.
It's just the way it worked. Right? Like my preference would have been 2 front ends in October and none in November, but that's just the way it goes sometimes.
Especially when you're in the idea business, you live or die by the strength of that idea and you're better off pushing it to make the best idea.
Typically in the financial world in general too, from idea for a copywriter, right? To come sit down with an editor and come like, hey, this is the idea I'm going to write about, to actually hitting the calendars 2.5 months.
Right.
Yeah. So, because it takes 2 to 3 weeks to write up the idea, right? A week to get through legal, a couple of weeks to get it recorded, and then a couple of weeks post. Like it just takes time to get through those things.
So that's where you stand on the front end promotions. Talk to me about the asset, which was the list, and what your assumption was on it and where you're at today. Walk me through when it happened as you realized like, okay, maybe we were ambitious on the percentage and here's what we should expect? Or was it more of a, just because I think one thing, the list always tells you what it is.
Exactly.
And how does that impact your math?
Yeah. So one of the things that we had done, so we launched a backend, right? We went through the process, did a backend promotion, which is basically a $1,500 to $2,000 product. We tried to launch it at $2,000, drove a lot of traffic through it and had very little results. This is why, to me, it's about the customer. It's like, hey, my opinion was this was going to work well, right? And this model would work the way we wanted to do it. The fact is it didn't. So as we're going through the process, we're driving traffic. We'd use some affiliates that were driving traffic for us, and that traffic just wasn't converting. I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't make any sense for us to continue to build 2 back-end promotions every single month and drive plenty of traffic through it and end up with 0 results.
Yeah, if you're not making revenue,
Right?
what's the point?
And because we drove so much traffic through the damn thing, like we assumed something was busted. Like that, that it was physically impossible to drive that many names through a promo and not have an order, right? And so we took a step back and we're like, okay, so yeah, we drove the names through the promo, but we didn't drive the right names and we didn't drive it the way we should have. So we took a step back. We said, okay, why don't we push off some of the others? You got to get copywriters in the mix, right? So we pushed off when some of those other promos will launch. And we said, let's focus our efforts on the front end. Let's focus our efforts on acquiring customers to then sell that customer product number 2. In the newsletter business, we use the front end and back end, but I know we got people that aren't in the newsletter business. It's the same general concept of having a brick and mortar store and somebody walks in and buys number 1 product from you, right? And in order for you to really make money, you got to buy product 2, 3, and 4. And the reality is most brick and mortar stores don't capture that name. They let the guy do 1 product and walk out the door, right? Most businesses don't capture that name. They do 1 product and go out the door. What we try to do is circumvent it and say, okay, well, why don't we see if some people will just go straight to product number 2, the high-end product? And they just didn't.
Right.
And so we readjusted when we said, hey, let's just focus our entire efforts right now on building up a base that are buying that initial front-end newsletter, that are buying that initial front-end product, that less than $100 spend with us. As we do that, we can do some different things. So rather than building a promotion, taking 2.5 months to do it, why don't we turn on a live event, right? So basically a live webinar or a live, I wouldn't even call it a webinar, right? It really is an event, right? You reach out to the entire list, say, hey, by the way, tomorrow, the guy that you've been following is going to go live and he's going to talk about this. If you're interested, show up.
It's more of a topic than like a big idea.
Yeah. What we know is when you get big, you can do much more general things, right? The smaller you are, the closer you have to get them to the guy. Proximity is such a huge deal. So the closer you can get them to him, the better. So we did that. We turned on a live event. He talked about a subject that he did. He did a okay job selling it. And I say okay, right? On a 0 to 10, he was probably a 3.5.
A little less than okay to me.
Well, I mean, that's in that okay, right? First time really trying it, right?
I
always take all the pressure off on these guys. I'm like, look, the job is to learn right now. Right?
Yeah.
We had to figure out the tech, how to get everybody on there. We had to figure out how this guy to go through.
And you don't have the foundation, so it's not a 6-figure risk. You do this and it doesn't work. And,
Exactly. Now's the time to do it. Now's the time to work out all the bugs.
Yeah.
Well, he did an okay job. We actually got outstanding results. So we did way better than I thought we would. And sometimes when you take the pressure off, focus on the results, and you focus on the process, sometimes the results show up. But I don't know if that was necessarily the case, but I just know that
I agree with the principle, though.
Pretty happy with what we did. So now we're just adjusting that acquisition. You take the feedback in, you see what the customers are telling you. They're telling you, hey, we don't want you to keep doing this. So we're like, hey, we should try something else, right? And you look at what others are doing successful and we're like, hey, why don't we try one of those? And what do we got to lose? Try one of those. Now this can be a part of our plan over the next 12 months.
Yeah. And it's interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, obviously in business, you have surprises. Sometimes you got good surprises and sometimes you have not so good. I'll use the okay term here, the 3.5 out of 10 surprise. And I think that's particularly true when you're just starting out, because while the stakes are low, like if it doesn't happen, it's not a big deal. The surprises are high stakes because you have nothing else to rely on, right? I can expect X to do this much and I expect Y to do this much. You don't have that. What were some other surprises in this, like the setback of your IP health or whatever, that maybe either pushed you forward and give you a new avenue or set you back that you've had to make a hard or different decision on?
There's not a ton, really.
You
So
mean in 5 months? They're having.
I was
hope not.
surprised that we launched those 2 front ends. The first one worked pretty good. The second one's working great. And typically you don't have 2
No, you're
right on the front end.
25% that.
So that's been a good surprise, right? That's been really nice that we've got 2 different acquisition models. We have 2 editors. The one we've got launched, the one's trailing behind, and he's about 4 months behind where the other one would be. Just
Have you actually launched him yet? Or?
So we haven't, right? So,
okay.
So that's one of the bad surprises, right? We lined up a copywriter to work on that package. We decided to launch him on the front end first, make sure that we build the base so we don't make the same mistake twice. And in doing that, that copywriter had some time commitments that are about 30 days more than what would have been nice.
Gotcha.
But that's just the way it works sometimes.
So you had to choose between, do I go find someone else that is not as good, or do I hold out for the guy I want?
Exactly. And then when you make those decisions sometimes, because I had another concept of introducing him into the file and then building up his front end file. But because we'd already made the agreement with him, that would be the first front end we launched. It kind of, you have some of those things that you agree to that in hindsight, you're like, man, I shouldn't agree to that. There's always stuff like that in business. There's some trade-offs. He wouldn't have written it if I'd not made the agreement, but I'm like, could we have done better with not as great a guy and done my plan and that? Or are we better off just doing this? You don't know.
It's one of those things you'll never know.
And I won't know, right? I think the biggest thing in a mode like this is having a game plan, figuring things out, and then being flexible. So one of the things that we didn't do a ton of in the beginning, just because it was so much of infrastructure development and software and all those things, right? Figuring out everybody, the designer's working with new software than he's normally used to working with, right? Everybody's got a different thing. So you have to work through that stuff. But one of the things that we finally did in September was sit down and build a Q4 plan. Not like a marketing plan, because I already had the marketing plan. We built 2 plans. Number 1 is next quarter, each week, what are we going to do each week? What's our big rock for each week? What are we going to do?
Oh,
right?
That's good.
And so we came up with 13 major initiatives that we're going to do each one of those things. And so will we hit them all? Likely not, right? Because you want to do everything yesterday, right?
Yeah,
You're like, hey, I need to turn this on. I want to do that.
But if you had 13 and you did 6, as opposed to having 6 and doing 3,
And now we made a conscious choice based on looking at things and saying, okay, well, that's important, but we really can't do it until here. So let's do it here where it's important instead of it just sitting there being like, hey, we should really do this.
Yeah.
So we got those things in place, right? The other thing that I like doing at the end of Q3 is to build a next year plan. I usually work backwards. I say, if I want to make $20 million, what do I need to do for each of these things in order to make $20 million? Instead of sitting down and saying, we're going to do this and this, how much money we're going to make, right? Why don't you just build your plan? Say, hey, I want to make 20 million bucks. How do we do it, right? Well, we know that this is how we'd market. Okay, in order to market, this is the size of the file we need, and this is how many front-end names we need. That's what it comes down to.
I want to dig into that because it really tees up a lot of things we say, but also it's in my opinion, such a great way to look at it because, one, if you choose the outcome, you've now got a direction. And then you use math to work yourself back on what must be true for that to occur. And then it makes your plan for you, right? Yeah. It really does. And what's so interesting about that too is instead of saying, if we do all the right things, we'll make money, like it will go well, you're consciously making the choice.
Yep.
And the fact is, I bet even if instead of doing 20, it was 18, you're not going to go, damn it.
Like, exactly. So we do it by editor, right? And then we total them up for the business because really, ultimately, in the financial niche, it's the easiest way to do it is by each of these individual guys because the individual guys are the talent.
They drive the revenue.
Yeah, exactly, right? So we did it for each of the individual editors and tiled it up. But in essence, what it does is it gives you, right? Number one, we came up with a goal. We're like, okay, we're going to make 20 million bucks. When we backed it all the way down, we're going, okay, so this is how we can market it. This is what each of those marketing events need to generate. So a webinar needs to make $1 million. Okay, great. And we know if you want a webinar to make $1 million, right? You're selling a $2,000 product, got to sell 500 on a webinar. I know that, I got a 5% conversion rate. I need 25,000 people to go through the order form. You're like, okay, we need to get, 60,000 people to the landing page. Are we going to get 60,000 people to a landing page? Right? And now you start to balance those things out. You work your way all the way down. And ultimately what it gets you down to, when you back it all the way down, it gets you down to a number that you can control. Because I can't control $20 million, honestly. I can't control really $1 million on a webinar. what I can control is landing page views, right?
Right.
What I can control in this business is ultimately you pull it all the way down. And for this business, right, what I found out is what really matters is front-end acquisition. How many names do we put on the list today? That's what it comes down to. So to make $20 million, I need to put
Is that your actual goal for next year?
Yeah, right around $20 million. Yep.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you right. You are going to go from $0 5 months ago.
Yeah.
And
well, we're already on pace for $1 million a year.
Yeah.
Right?
So what's 20x that?
I know it sounds ridiculous, right?
No, but I love the process of instead of going, hey, we're on pace for 1 million this year. If we do better than 1 million, we're growing, is you're choosing where you want to be.
Yeah. So we're on pace for 1 million this year, but really we've only been at it 2 months, right? If you think about it, right? For the first 3 months, we spend on the infrastructure, right? So in 2 months, we're already on pace for $1 million.
So what you're saying is starting a business is easy. That's what I'm getting out of this.
No, that's definitely not easy, right? But it definitely helps when you got a pile of leads. You didn't have to pay for it.
Yeah, that's
it definitely is a big
strategic.
Benefit, right? When you have no marketing expense, right? Like they talked about on Shark Tank, some of the products on Shark Tank were only viable because they'd been on Shark Tank and they literally had zero marketing costs, right?
Yeah.
The acquisition was zero because cost of goods sold and all the other shit that they had to do ate up such a big part of it. It was the only way they got a 25% margin. Because if they had to spend 25% on marketing, now they don't make any money. But back to the thing, when I balance it all the way down, it really does come into, okay, if I put 100 front-end names on the file, I'll have 36,500 front-end names at the end of the year. You figure out attrition and all the other stuff that happens, refund rates, everything else. And what's interesting to know in the financial niche is just because somebody refunds the front end doesn't mean they actually don't buy a back end, which just blew me away. I kind of assumed like, hey, if you don't want the $79 product, why would you stay on the list and buy the $2,000 product? But they do at a healthy clip. I mean, enough that it's not an accident. I think 36% of the people that refunded a front end went on to buy a back end. Oh. It was a ridiculous number, 1 in 3, right? You're like, but anyways, you balance it all the way down and you're like, okay, I need to acquire this many front end names. I acquire this many front end names, this many customers, right? Then acquiring those customers generates this X dollars, right? Those customers, a percentage of these, ultimately, if we do this right, I know in the financial niche that in general, whatever promotion that guy comes in on, okay, let me take a step back because I want to talk this through. I only acquire names that I can monetize, plain and simple, right? So
begin with the end in mind.
Yeah. So the definition of that is when I acquire a name, 8% of those names have to go on to buy a back end. Otherwise, at the end of the day, you're acquiring, right? You might have $1 million in income, but you really had $1 million in expenses. So you acquired a bunch of names, but
it's a wash.
It didn't really matter because you didn't make any more money. You made the money, you paid the commissions, you paid the salaries, you paid everything else.
Vanity metrics.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, oh, I have 100,000 name list. No, you don't. You might as well have zero because you made no profit, right? There, you made no money. So for me, that's 8%. So I know as you're looking through this list, you're like, okay, well, of this many names, 8% of those will go on to buy a back end, generate this much revenue, and it balances it out.
And I think this ties in perfectly with what you just said. You talked about like, look, I know I can build your business, right? Yep. And I assume in that instance, you need short-term revenue to prove a point.
Yep.
Right? Especially when you're starting a business, you need short-term revenue to buy some bandwidth.
Yep.
One of the things I think you've done better than anyone else I've personally interacted with is long-term business building. You're willing to forego or sacrifice money today for a bigger, healthier, more efficient business a year from now. Talk to me a little bit about this short-term revenue versus long-term business building.
So the reality is I want both, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to sacrifice one for the other. I want them both. And sometimes, just like when you're working on projects, right? When you're sitting down and planning out your day, a percentage of your day should be on today tasks, a percentage should be on midterm tasks, and a percentage should be on projects, long-term tasks. Otherwise, all you do is run around and put fires out all day, and the business is no better off a year from now than it was today, right? Which is what a lot of people do. So when I sat down and helped that guy before, I knew he had a file. I know there's a couple assumptions I made going in, right? And they're fairly valid assumptions. Almost any business in the country does not monetize very well, right? So I knew he had a file, and I knew I could build a promotion to his file, generate revenue, and use that revenue to generate more business. And that's exactly what we did. Oh, by the way, he also had a big friggin' list of names that he never marketed to. So in this case, you go through and you're like, hey, look, yes, you want short-term revenue, but you also want to build a business. Most of Agora, especially over the last 5 to 7 years, most Agora businesses are not businesses, they're promotions.
Yeah.
They had very successful promotions and they literally just wake up each day and they're like, hey, we had a great promotion. What are we going to sell to these guys? I'm like, it's not a business. In some of the years at Legacy, we didn't have what I would call great working front ends. And we were still doing 800 to 1,000 front end orders a day. Why? Because we had built an infrastructure, right? And so even without an outstanding working front end, we had 15 or 20 of them that were generating enough revenue and working and monetizing that we bolted them all together. It's amazing to me because it just seems common sense to me. The more front ends you had, the more stable you were as a business. At our peak, we were launching 40 new front ends a year at Legacy, which is a lot, right? Like I get it, right?
Better than 3 a month.
I'm going to launch 12 here, 1 a month, because ultimately it provides stability. But I knew businesses at the Agora world that were launching 3 or 4 a year, like 3 front ends a year. You're like, how do you do that? Because they lived and died on that single promotion. They weren't building a business.
They relied on the going out of stock sale that you see the mattress have. I've never seen a mattress store go out of business more times.
Exactly. Every 6 weeks they're going out of business.
They're like,
going out of business sale.
Clearinghouse. I want to go back to it. You talked about you knew you could make money if you just kept the IPs and you would have been less efficient.
Yep.
That's short-term revenue.
Yep.
But you knew that it would cost you way more in the long term. And you made a value decision.
Yeah, because I'm trying to build a $100 million company. I'm not trying to build a $20 million company.
So that's what I want to dig into. Like, how are you making that decision? Obviously, it's not a day-by-day business, but as you have some of these hiccups, you're like, okay, this is a hard decision. What are you using as the metric of, hey, here's what a value difference means for the business between just moving forward or doing it right?
So the biggest thing you have to know is what kind of pot of money do you have to work with? What's your runway? If you go back to Silicon Valley, almost every one of those businesses, that's the thing each day is they're working on something, right? They're looking at it and saying, hey, I have 8 months runway. So I've got to reach these certain spots along the way.
They're building to their next raise.
Yeah. Or when some of these companies sold, they literally had weeks of revenue left. Yeah. So they're like, we need to raise more money because we're not going to generate enough business over the next few weeks. We don't have a project. We don't have these things in the pipeline, right? You can pull, especially in Silicon Valley, like you can pull tomorrow revenue today by discounting.
Yep.
Right. And so they do a lot of that.
Or you see they'll do like a lifetime deal on their product to bring in a bunch of money. Yeah. But there's a hard and fixed cost to that.
You know, that's in that world. In our world, I look at the runway I have, I look at what our burn rate is, what we're doing, and what we've done to give us further runway. Those are all your decisions. Even though there's some outstanding talent out there and outstanding talent let go across all of Agora, we didn't hire them.
Yeah.
It is hard, right? Ultimately, they're great for the long-term aspect of the business, but they shoot you in the foot on the short term.
You know, they're a $2 million employee, but not for 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. There's editors out there that I'd love to have, but I still have one I'm in the process of launching. Sometimes you just have to forego some of those things that you know are great in the long term that are actually detrimental in the short term. And
the opportunity can't be shinier than reality.
Exactly. You just have to make that hard choice and decision and say, hey, okay, what can I actually do, right?
All right, I take it back. It sounds like starting a business really hard.
Everything's a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Even when you take short-term revenue, you're trading off maybe long-term goodwill on the customer.
You're taking in some of the value you've built.
Yep.
Right? And that relational value.
We used to call it goodwill. Every time you put a promotion, you pull goodwill out of the list.
Yeah, and you're taking a deposit or you're withdrawing that, and you have to deposit twice as much to make up for the withdrawal.
Yep. That's why you try to provide value. You try to do the right things, take care of the customer, focus on the fact is none of this shit matters or exists if it's not for the customer.
I want to kind of finish this, if we can, with a bang. If there was someone starting a business, and let's just call it in the internet space, right? Ultimately, they start the business because they want some outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
So what should they do? What should they avoid? And what's a piece of advice to get them to where they want to go?
So I'll work backwards. So the piece of advice that I would give right off the bat.
Why do you always work backwards like that?
The biggest thing is be realistic about what you're going to do and then double it, right? Like,
wow.
When we're remodeling houses going in, like, I'm like, hey, this is going to cost 10 grand to do. I put a 20 grand budget together because what don't you see, right?
Yeah.
So I was sharing this the other day with somebody. One of my favorite things, and this is what I focus on every day in my role. One of my favorite things came out of a guy named Keith Cunningham, a great business mentor, and Keith's out of Austin, Texas. But Keith goes, look, in business, there's 2 things you need to focus on, right? The assumptions that you're making and what you don't see. Those are the 2 things that bite you in the ass, right? Being realistic about what you're doing. What assumptions did you make? What assumptions did I make going into this business? I'd be able to do 2 back ends to every 1 front end. Ultimately, that assumption's wrong. There's other assumptions I made that are right. And so you have to constantly focus on what assumptions you're making. Like in order to get to 20 million next year, my assumption is I can sell 100 front ends a day. Is that realistic or not? Well, we're doing 75 right now. Can we get from 75 to 100? Do we have the dollars? Do we have the manpower? Do I have the promotions? Do I have all the things that it takes to get me from 75 to 100 between now and January 1st? And then are we going to have the things in place next year to get us to stay over 100 from January to December? Because that's the requirement. So what assumptions are you making and what you don't see, right? And it's hard to be like, okay, what am I not seeing? But ask yourself that over and over again. You start to see around corners, right? You start to see like, okay, what am I not seeing? You'll hear things and be like, oh, like I had a thing jump on today that just happened to be something back and forth. And I'm like, well, wait a second. That's not what we agreed to.
That would have taken you 6 degrees off.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, okay, we got to pull that thing back because that's deadly. Clearly, I didn't do a great job voicing what I wanted to the guys that are now dealing with that.
Yeah.
And if that had gone down that path, it would have cost us a lot of money. Ultimately, I want it to generate money for us, not cost us money, right? Like I'm in the cheap acquisition mode right now.
Efficient.
So that's the advice, right? To focus on assumptions.
What's one thing you should do and what's one thing you should avoid like the plague?
The one thing that you need to do is understand, like, what are all the resources I have? Who do I know? What can I leverage? Because really in the beginning with business, you either have a pile of money, you can go out and get leads, or you got to leverage them from somebody.
Right.
There's lots of places, right? ClickBank was a big one where people put JV offers out there and help drive traffic through your stuff, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is most people sit and build shit on paper and build a plan and never get started, right? So do something in your business. Do something every day. Dan Kennedy used to say, I should do one thing every single day to generate future business. You know, in his case, he's in the fax machine world. He's like, send a fax to a client, sign a book deal, do whatever. Like there's one thing that should focus on long-term business and not just getting money today. Otherwise, you end up in that rat race like most small businesses where all you've done is create a job for yourself. You don't actually have a business.
Yeah.
You have a small job.
Yeah. What's one thing you should not do or should avoid?
Just biting off more than you can chew. I would love to have those editors. But the reality is if I grab those editors, long-term, is it going to be great for the business? Sure. But it's going to set us back in the short term to get to that long term. So it's actually going to take us longer to get to that goal than if I'm realistic. And I've had these guys reach out. I got relationships with them. They're like, hey, I'd love to work with you. I'm like, yeah, love to work with you too, but I can't right now.
Yeah.
And being transparent, right?
And you don't know if that opportunity is going to be there when you are ready, but you have to be okay with
but I
that.
have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to balance it out. Sometimes you have to be like, hey, this was my path, but that's available. Can we get enough revenue? Can we do something to just buy it and pigeonhole it and set it over here for a little while before we get going? Or can we not? Right. And so, you know, for me right now, like all that stuff, it's just getting in the way of the ultimate goal, which is to get the 2 guys I got going and generate the 20 million bucks.
All right. Well, I think there's a lot of value. There's a lot here. I really recommend you go back and listen to this one twice, really, because there's so much in this that even I'm getting out of that I know I'm going to go back and do. But before I do that, I know I owe my wife a chicken mansion. So
chicken mansion.
So I got to get on to that. But we'll see you next week.
Sounds good.
You've been listening to Marketing from the Edge podcast. If you want to hear more of our thoughts every week, visit marketingedgepod.com. We'll share more of our very best lessons, thoughts, strategies for growing a business, as well as some personal stories here from the edge of the world. Invest a couple minutes of your morning and we'll give you the blueprint to growing your business from where it's at today to where you want it to be. That's marketingedgepod.com. If you want to reach out to us directly, feel free to email Cody at marketingedgepod.com and you might get a surprise bonus.